Greetings and welcome back, gentles and ladiesmen, to another Shrek-siding episode of Remake or Rebreak. I'm ExoParadigmGamer, and it's time to move on to a series I've wanted to cover for years, and something that many of you have probably never even heard of. Klonoa is a series that's never received that much attention from the gaming community, for reasons we'll be discussing along the way. While the advent of gaming content on YouTube has helped to give Klonoa more exposure, I still think this is one of the most underrated IPs in gaming, and one that I'd love to see given another chance. To that end, I've decided to do a comprehensive marathon looking at every Klonoa game released to date. Yes, even that one. I'm leaving no stone unturned, because I want to explain why Klonoa is one of the best gaming IPs you've never played. And what better way to start than with a brand new episode of my fan favorite segment, Remake or Rebreak. In this segment, I review the classics of the past to see how well they hold up today, with a special emphasis on how well their subsequent ports, remakes, or re-releases improve upon the original experience. For the first episode of this marathon, we're going to be looking at a PlayStation gem called Klonoa Door to Phantomile, as well as its remake for the Nintendo Wii. Without further ado, this is Door to Phantomile, Remake or Rebreak. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, a short history lesson is in order. You're all probably familiar with a company called Bandai Namco, formerly just Namco. This Japanese gaming firm is behind such IPs as Splatterhouse, Tales of, Mr. Driller, Tekken, Tower of Juaga, and even Dark Souls. Pac-Man is probably the company's most recognizable IP, frequently making cameo appearances in their other work. In the late 1990s, Namco was in talks to create a new game licensed off an existing IP. When those talks fell through, the company commissioned the project's director, Hideo Yoshizawa, to create a new action platforming game with the resources he had. At the time, 3D action games were all the rage, but Yoshizawa thought they were too complicated to play and felt traditional 2D game design was more accessible. In the end, Yoshizawa decided to compromise between 2D and 3D gameplay by combining them into a 2.5D playstyle, with an emphasis on using enemies to solve puzzles. Yoshizawa also wanted his project to be cinematic and story-driven, believing other developers didn't prioritize these qualities enough. Originally, the game was going to be relatively serious, but it eventually evolved into something more lighthearted and comical. The plot, characters, and settings were designed around a dream motif, with the goal of making something that both children and adults could relate to. The main character was designed by Yoshihiko Arai, who at first unveiled a darker character named Shady, but was unsatisfied with it and went back to the drawing board. The resulting character had long rabbit-like ears, a cat-like face, a necklace, and a giant hat with the retro Pac-Man symbol on it. Klonoa the Dream Traveler was born. The game was released to Japanese audiences in 1997 and debuted in the West a few months later in 1998. Door to Phantomile was praised by critics as a fresh new take on the side-scrolling genre, and received Editor's Choice Awards from both GameSpot and Imagine Games Network. Despite its critical success, Door to Phantomile made only a decent dent in terms of finance, selling approximately 180,000 copies worldwide as of February 2016. Compare that to the 7.58 million copies that Crash Bandicoot 2 has sold in that same time frame, and you'll see why Namco was disappointed. But Namco hadn't given up on Klonoa just yet. After the release of Door to Phantomile, Namco gave Klonoa his own Sonic Team equivalent, Klonoa Works, which went on to develop 6 more games in the early 2000s. After the Japanese-only release of Klonoa Heroes in 2002, and a North American localization for Dream Champ Tournament in 2005, the Klonoa franchise went dormant for 6 whole years as Namco lost financial interest in the series and moved on to other projects. But the Dream Traveler's luck changed in 2005 when Namco merged with fellow Japanese electronics manufacturer Bandai. The new corporate leadership stated a desire to bring Klonoa back, and so the firm commissioned Yoshizawa to direct a remake of Door to Phantomile with developer Payon. Yoshizawa felt that Klonoa's character design was perhaps a little too 90s, so Arai was asked to produce a redesign for the character. Namco Bandai conducted a survey asking gamers whether they preferred the original design or the redesign. When respondents overwhelmingly favored the original design, the new design was scrapped. Klonoa Door to Phantomile was released for the Nintendo Wii in Japan in 2008, but was released under the title of just Klonoa in the rest of the world that following year. Much like previous Klonoa games, the remake failed to make the financial impact that Bandai Namco was hoping for, selling a meager 160,000 copies. And that's a shame, because to this day, Klonoa for the Nintendo Wii is the last Klonoa game ever released. Truly ironic that the very game which gave birth to an underrated series of games would ultimately spell its untimely end. The plot of Klonoa Door to Phantomile is actually quite substantial compared to most platforming games on the market. Looking at the Wii version's cover, you'd expect something cutesy and lighthearted, with the actual narrative being fairly minimalistic. While some of that can be true at times, Door to Phantomile's story has a lot more going on than you might think. Let's start with a brief synopsis. Klonoa is a wind villager who lives in the windmill-powered Breeze Gale. He's best friends with a spirit named Hupo, who lives in the magic wind ring that Klonoa discovered while walking in the woods one day. One morning, after waking up from a dream blighted by dark imagery, Klonoa and Hupo observe a spaceship crash in a nearby Bell Hill and decide to investigate. When they arrive, they discover that a dark spirit named Gaudius and his assistant Joka have abducted Lafise, a diva from the mythical Moon Kingdom who was able to rejuvenate the world of Phantomile by singing her song of rebirth. With Lafise and Gaudius' custody, evil forces and nightmare energy are allowed to flow unchecked, meaning that Phantomile will gradually succumb to darkness. After defeating one of Joka's monsters, Klonoa and Hupo uncover a moon pendant, which Lafise hid in the bell to prevent Gaudius from reaching the Moon Kingdom. Klonoa and Hupo ask their caretaker Grandpa for guidance, and he requests that the duo travel to Forlock Forest to visit a tribal leader known as Granny. As someone well versed in the legends of the Moon Kingdom, Granny is the only one who can help the duo put a stop to Gaudius' plans. Klonoa and Hupo accept, departing Breeze Gale for an adventure spanning Phantomile and beyond. So, if you couldn't tell from the summary I just gave you, this is a lot more complicated than your typical cutesy platformer. And I didn't even get into the darker moments or any of the twists and turns that take place later in the game. Before I talk about some of those moments in the spoiler section, I'd like to give my overall impressions of the story. Let's begin with the presentation. Door to Phantomile conveys its story through your typical text-based cutscenes, but also offers voice acting spoken in a fictional language called Phantomilan. Unlike the dinosaur language in Star Fox Adventures, which basically sounds like jumbled English with unmodified nouns, this game's Phantomilan makes for a much more convincing fictional language, seeing as it has its own syntax and grammatical structure. Another small design choice that pulls it all together is that the words appear in synchronization with the voices, which allows you to connect the Phantomilan speech with the text on screen. Taken together, this approach allows for expressive characters and somewhat dynamic cutscenes without the presentation suffering from the dated localization afflicting so many games of its time. The worst thing I can say about these cutscenes is that the voices sound like they were recorded with a potato, but since it's basically gibberish to begin with, that doesn't really matter. The game also makes use of a handful of CG cutscenes, which are replaced with real-time cutscenes in the Wii Remake. The CG still looks pretty good, if a bit pixelated, but it's 240i, so you can only expect so much. Beyond the creative presentation, one of the things that makes Door to Phantomile's story so great is its cast of likable characters. Not all of them are as well developed or three-dimensional as, say, Luke Phone Fob, but each are appealing and likable for their own reasons. Klonoa is our happy-go-lucky hero with a kind heart and a dedication to doing what's right. Hupo is a supportive, cutesy sidekick who actually turns out to be a plot-important character. Joka is your laughably evil dragon character who starts off as an incompetent nemesis for Klonoa, but gradually becomes more unhinged as the game goes on. Beyond the main characters, there are many side characters that may even rival those of the Jak and Daxter or Ratchet & Clank series. From the love star Blue the Mason to the absent-minded King Seedoff, everyone leaves a mark on you in some way. Though we don't see as much of Gaudius in this game as I would have preferred, he does come off as legitimately menacing, and unlike your typical dark spirit character, his motivations actually make some sense and are easy to sympathize with. And then there are those twists I was talking about earlier.
Ah, spoiler alert!
I think the moment I realized that Klonoa was something truly special was when I first saw this scene right here. Up to this point, Joka was a rather silly villain that was difficult to take seriously, even when he was holding Granny hostage. But in this scene, he destroys Klonoa's home and murders Grandpa just to steal back the moon pendant. That was when I realized that Joka was way more twisted than the game was initially letting on. And then there's Grandpa's death scene, taking place immediately afterwards. The fact that this scene has the emotional impact it does is a testament to the strength of the presentation. Hearing Klonoa scream in pain and sorrow over the death of his only family is legitimately heartbreaking. but nothing beats that final scene. In most games, the ending is typically a pleasant one that ties up all the loose ends and leaves you feeling warm inside. Door to Phantomile subverts this trope, and the reveals surrounding Klonoa and Hupo are central to this. The player is led to believe throughout the entire game that Klonoa was born and raised in Phantomile, and that Hupo has always been his friend for most of his life. Later, it's revealed that Hupo was secretly the Prince of the Moon Kingdom, and that he'd summoned Klonoa to Phantomile in a bid to stop Gaudius. To get Klonoa on his side, Hupo planted memories in his head of their past friendship. Everything the player and Klonoa were led to believe was a lie, but over the course of the game, Hupo grows remorseful of his actions and develops a legitimate bond with Klonoa, who in turn comes to view Hupo as a true friend. When Hupo confesses to his manipulation, Klonoa reacts with denial and emotional outrage. But at that very moment, Laphise rejuvenates the world with her Song of Rebirth, signaling the end of Klonoa's stay in the dream world of Phantomile. Despite Hupo's best efforts to preserve his friendship, he is unable to overcome fate, and Klonoa is sucked out of Phantomile and returned to his home world. In any other game, this scenery and music would be happy and uplifting, but in a twist of bitter irony, Door to Phantomile makes it one of the saddest things you'll ever see in a video game. Sure, you defeated the villain and won the day, but you were unable to preserve the one thing that mattered most. Yeah, I'll admit it. I actually cried the first time I saw this ending. Overall, the story in Klonoa Door to Phantomile manages to walk a very fine line and appeal to gamers of all ages. Younger gamers can appreciate the game's lighthearted tone and humorous nature, while adults can appreciate the memorable characters and the game's darker, sadder moments. Door to Phantomile's plot is one that sticks with you after your first playthrough, and one that you'll continue to appreciate in your second and third. So what about the Wii version? There are actually quite a few changes that are worth discussing here. While the substance of the script is more or less the same, there are a handful of translational differences. The diva Laphise is now the songstress Laphise, Granny is now the chiefess, and Joka is now referred to as Joker for some reason. As a slight spoiler, Joka does appear in several other Klonoa games, so changing his name to Joker feels unnecessary. Another change is that rather than using a static text box that appears at the bottom of the screen, dialogue now appears in floating word balloons that change positions during cutscenes, which, coupled with the more dynamic camera angles, allows for an overall more cinematic feel. The biggest change to the story presentation, however, is the addition of English voice acting. Despite what you might expect, this new voice acting is actually pretty well done. Almost every character, particularly Hupo, feels well cast, and the delivery is strong and generally appealing. The fact that characters are speaking in a language I can understand, coupled with the more dynamic text box system, makes for cutscenes that are overall more compelling than the original. There's only one problem, and unfortunately, it's a big one. Klonoa is now voiced by Eric Stitt, who does not fit the character at all. For the most part, every other character sounds more or less like the original Phantomile voice actors, but Klonoa goes from a high-pitched cutesy voice to a grating pubescent one.
Wahoo! Come on, let's go!
It's something I got used to the longer I heard it, but god damn, could they really not have found something a little more familiar? It's like listening to Kirk Thornton trying to voice Shadow the Hedgehog in Sonic Boom: The Rise of Lyric. Despite Thornton being a great voice actor who's done some great work in other media, I cringed every time I heard Shadow speak in that game. And Eric Stitt as Klonoa makes me feel the exact same way. I think it's safe to say that my brother Eric has a more fitting Klonoa voice.
Ouch, that hurt.
Well, anyway, we better get going, Klonoa.
They don't pay me enough for this shit.
Oh no! I died! I fell in the lava!
Listen, you have no proof that just happened.
Thankfully, if you're hungry for something closer to the original, the game does give you the option to play the game in Phantomile, with Klonoa once again voiced by Kumiko Watanabe. The only drawback is that the text box are paced with the English voice acting in mind, so unlike the original, the Phantomile won't synchronize with the words as they appear on screen. This means that characters may only make a few noises and then leave you to watch the text box slowly catch up with what they're actually saying. All things considered, though, that's a pretty minor complaint and one that I think most people would be willing to overlook. Overall, the story and presentation of Klonoa Door to Phantomile are excellent, with the Wii version slightly improving things in some aspects. Let's move on to the aesthetics. Door to Phantomile's art design is pretty damn good if I do say so myself. Like most 3D platforming games of its time, Door to Phantomile features fully rendered 3D environments with vibrant, colorful textures and some great looking level geometry. In fact, I dare say that beyond a handful of blocky looking assets here and there, the geometry in Door to Phantomile still holds up decently today. Unlike the environments, however, the characters are represented with 2D sprites rather than 3D models. For the most part, they look pretty convincing by today's standards. The game uses a specific shading technique to make sprites look more like 3D character models, much like the recently released Mario & Luigi Paper Jam, which keeps the sprites from clashing with the backgrounds. The only time where I felt the illusion was shattered was when the game employed the use of larger enemies. It looks like they just scaled the normal size sprites to make them twice as big, instead of giving them larger sprites with double the pixel density. This only happens in a handful of instances, but it's still jarring nonetheless. The art direction is also fantastic. The environments make use of familiar design cues, but still manage to put their own spin on old tropes. Character designs are great too, with each character looking visually distinct and memorable in their own ways. Surprisingly, even someone like Ghadius fits right in with the cutesier characters in the game. Considering that Yoshizawa's goal was to create a world that could appear in anyone's dreams, the artists did an excellent job designing the characters and locales of Phantomile. Thanks to its cartoony aesthetic, Door to Phantomile remains visually appealing to this day. That being said, let's move on to the Wii remake. While the PlayStation original still holds up pretty well all things considered, the Wii version looks significantly better. It's actually a considerable improvement over the game's PlayStation 2 sequel, Klonoa 2 Lunatea's Veil. Hell, I dare say that Klonoa is one of the best looking games on the Wii. This game could almost pass for an early Xbox 360 or PlayStation 3 title, it looks so good. It's every bit as bright and colorful as the original, except with more detailed textures and smoother level geometry. The character sprites from the original have been replaced with full character models, which still look great even 7 years later. The animations are very well done too. Hupo could have used a few extra polys to round himself out, but if that's the worst I can say about the character models, then I think this remake is doing pretty well for itself. What really seals the deal for me is the widescreen and progressive scan support, which makes the game look great on an HD TV. Overall, the Wii version is a major graphical improvement over the original and likely the remake's greatest strength. The soundtrack provides some great tunes to match the great visuals. Beyond a new musical treatment for the Song of Rebirth that plays between levels, the soundtrack seems to be the same in both the PlayStation and Wii versions of the game. Door to Phantomile actually has quite the girthy soundtrack considering the game's length, with over 60 musical tracks to listen to over the course of the game. And as surprising as it may sound, almost every one of these tracks is actually quite memorable. Take Baloo the Mason's theme, for example. By all accounts, he's just some NPC you happen to meet in the first vision, but his theme is actually one of the catchiest pieces in the game. I can't even accurately describe what kind of music it is. It's just fun to listen to. That goes for all of the other character themes as well. Grandpa's theme is relaxing and comforting, Joka's theme is sinister and over the top, and Hupo's theme fits the character and all of his baggage incredibly well. And then there's the level music, which actually has an impressive amount of variety. A lot of it is your typical cutesy platformer music, but as you get farther along in the game, the music becomes darker and more atmospheric in tone. The boss music is mostly techno, which contrasts nicely with the main stage music and does a great job establishing an atmosphere of conflict and tension. Overall, the soundtrack is just generally well composed and catchy and fits well with what's happening on screen. To tell you the truth, it's actually something I don't mind listening to every once in a while doing homework or writing scripts. It's an incredibly underrated soundtrack, so I'd recommend giving it a listen sometime if you haven't already. And with that, we can finally get into the gameplay. As mentioned previously, Klonoa Door to Phantomile is a 2.5D puzzle platforming game, meaning that all the action takes place along a winding 2D plane that snakes across 3D geometry. If you've ever played Kirby 64 or the Crystal Shards for Nintendo 64, then you have a pretty good idea of how Door to Phantomile handles. You take control of Klonoa, who is able to jump and flap his ears to hover for a short time, not unlike Yoshi's flutter jump. It doesn't give you nearly as much distance though, so you're encouraged to use it as a way to jump slightly farther or to salvage poorly timed jumps. Taking a page from American Super Mario Bros. 2, a staple of Klonoa's gameplay involves inflating enemies with his wind ring for use as a projectile attack. What makes Klonoa different from Mario 2 is that he can also throw enemies into the background and foreground, either to activate switches, get items, or attack enemies. Klonoa can also throw a captured enemy directly downward while in midair, which not only gives him an extra boost for platforming, but also allows him to attack whatever is below him. Enemies in Klonoa aren't just obstacles to get in your way, they're tools critical to progression, an ingenious twist on a genre that generally rewards players for brute force and memorization. While it sounds like these simple mechanics would get stale pretty quickly, they actually managed to stay interesting the whole way through, thanks in part to the game's short length. Door to Phantomile can be finished in about 3.5 hours, which admittedly leaves me somewhat conflicted. This would be a pretty good length for an early release Genesis or Super Nintendo game, but by the time the PlayStation and N64 came out, expectations had changed. Late release Super Nintendo games set the bar for beefier games with save features, and the onset of memory cards in 5th generation consoles only solidified this trend, with some exceptions. On the other hand, Door to Phantomile still feels like it's at the right length for what it's trying to do. Most stages can be beaten in about 6 minutes or so, which keeps the game from contracting Freedom Planet syndrome. The game doesn't feel obligated to needlessly pad out the gameplay or story to surpass some arbitrary length requirement, and that's a design choice I can respect. Plus, the game does have a reasonable amount of replay value, and the short length prevents the simple mechanics from overstaying their welcome. Another thing that keeps the mechanics interesting is the level design. There are 12 main levels in Door to Phantomile, which are grouped into 6 visions of 2 stages each. At the end of each vision, you'll fight a boss and move on to the next one. When you complete all of these stages, you'll move on to the final vision and face the final boss. What makes Klonoa fairly unique from the likes of Mario, Sonic, or Donkey Kong is the emphasis on its puzzle elements. Unlike those games where you just have to keep moving along until you reach the end, Klonoa forces the player to think more about the how of that progression. Because Klonoa is reliant on enemies to hit most switches or reach higher platforms, the game forces you to think about where you'll get the enemies, where and how you'll use them, and what enemies you'll throw and in what order. The enemy design forces you to think about this too. While all of this might sound terribly complicated, I think that if you were to play it for yourself, you'd find that it's actually fairly intuitive. I think that even younger gamers could pick up Door to Phantomile and finish it without too much hassle. In fact, if I had any criticisms of the puzzle elements, it's that they're a little on the simple side compared to the sequels, particularly to Dream Champ Tournament. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I think it makes Door to Phantomile the perfect place for newbies to wean themselves onto the mechanics before moving on to the more complex sequels. This observation also applies to the difficulty, which is very much on the easy side. While the game does start off pretty simple and gets harder as you progress, the game keeps you well stocked on lives and gives you a health bar with 6 hits, whereas most of the sequels only give you 3 hits. It's not Kirby levels of easy, and it is possible to get a game over if you're not being careful, but I think that most average skilled gamers will plow through this title without any issues. Honestly, I have no problem with that. I'd prefer a game be well designed and fun to play, but a little too easy, than have it be gnash your teeth frustrating and not fun to play because of it. But that's just my opinion. If you're someone who prefers more of a challenge in their platforming games, you'll probably want to look elsewhere. The bosses aren't really going to give you a run for your money either. They're all fairly creative and unique, each one involves a different strategy, and they do help to shake things up every couple of stages or so. Still, you'd be hard pressed to die against most of them. The last few bosses are a lot more aggressive and actually put up a fight. Better late than never, I suppose. Overall, the bosses are fairly decent, but I think they could afford to be a little more challenging than they actually are. If you're a completionist type who likes having side objectives in your platformers, then Door to Phantomile's got you covered. Basically, Ghadius's kidnapping of Lafise has allowed nightmare energy to flow unchecked, and Phantom Islands across the land have been captured in nightmare energy bubbles. Using enemies or as Wind Bullet, Klonoa can burst the bubbles and free the Phantom Islands from the nightmares. There are 6 Phantom Islands in each stage, and while you should be able to find them all as long as you're vigilant, some of them are pretty well hidden. Thankfully, the levels in this game are fairly short, so it doesn't take too long to find that one Phantom Island you happen to miss. Lunatea's Veil, eat your heart out. My only nitpick in this regard is that there are a few stages where things will branch off into several pathways without any sort of indication as to what's the way forward and what's just a side pathway. This can make tracking down Phantom Islands somewhat more annoying than it has to be, but at the very least there's nothing in the game preventing you from backtracking to the fork and taking the necessary path. That's one of my gaming pet peeves right there, where you accidentally miss something and you're not allowed to go back for it without restarting the stage. Thankfully, Door to Phantomile isn't one of those games. Another thing that does kind of suck about the PlayStation version is that if you miss a Phantom Island in a stage, you're not allowed to replay that stage until after you beat the game. At that point, you unlock a world map and can select stages to find the Phantom Islands that you happen to miss. Not a huge deal, but something that did bother me on my first playthrough. The Wii version fixes this by giving you access to the world map from the beginning, which I appreciate. If you can save all the Phantom Islands and defeat the final boss, you'll unlock an Extra Vision, which is actually a pretty good level featuring its own story. Overall, I really like the Phantom Island Rescue side quest. It gives you an incentive to poke your nose around the levels and see everything there is to see, it isn't unnecessarily annoying, and it leaves you well rewarded for your efforts. That more or less covers the gameplay in the original game, so it's time to talk about the remake's other additions. For one thing, the remake tweaks Klonoa's control slightly. In most Klonoa games, Klonoa's wind bullet will only shoot about a foot or so in front of him, which means you basically have to get right on top of enemies to grab them. I never thought this was a huge problem with the original or the other Klonoa titles, but I did admittedly wish that Klonoa's wind ring had a little more range to it. Fortunately for me, the Wii remake has tripled the range of Klonoa's wind bullet to about 3 feet or so, which makes picking up enemies feel a lot more comfortable in general. Apparently, Klonoa's movement speed was also raised slightly, and enemy hitboxes were enlarged, but these changes don't really feel that noticeable to me. One drawback that I did notice is that Klonoa takes a little longer to face the background and foreground, which did cause me to miss targets every once in a while. Still, it's nothing I couldn't get used to. Speaking of controls, the Wii version supports several controller options, including a sideways Wii Remote, a Wii Remote and Nunchuck, a classic controller, and even a GameCube controller. I played the game using a GameCube controller, and it made for an overall comfortable and responsive experience. So you might be wondering if the remake does anything to increase the game's difficulty from the PlayStation 1 days. Well, no. It actually makes things even easier, and that's mostly thanks to the fact that Klonoa can now take 10 hits as opposed to 6. And no, there's no difficulty setting. I appreciate that the remake was trying to appeal to younger, less experienced gamers, but what reason was there not to include a harder difficulty setting? Well, the game does actually have a reverse mode, which you unlock after finishing the main game. But unlike the mirror modes from Donkey Kong Country Returns or Mario Kart Wii, Klonoa's reverse mode doesn't really make the game harder in any substantial way. It's literally the exact same levels, only flipped. Well, that's not entirely true. Each reverse mode level does have a hidden vortex that will take you to a little challenge room, but these are more frustrating than they are challenging. Look at this one from the Forlock Forest level. What the hell am I supposed to do here? I keep getting knocked in the lava and dying instantly. If you manage to beat the challenge room, you'll win a gold medal. Only thing is, you don't get anything for getting them all, beyond bragging rights. So I don't see why I should be arsed to force myself through these challenge rooms. I don't understand why the remake couldn't have had an actual hard mode of some kind, or maybe another extra vision. Most of the other games in the series have at least 2 or 3 extra visions, and it's not like this game was super long to begin with. How hard could it have been to have added new levels? Beyond reverse mode, there are a couple of other things you unlock for finishing the game. First of all, you get a costume viewer, which allows you to change Klonoa into his Door to Phantomile and Lunatea's Veil outfits, as well as a couple of new ones. It's a purely cosmetic change, but I still appreciate the addition nonetheless. The second addition is a time attack mode, where you get to take on all of the bosses and try to set a record, similar to the Mammoth House in Klonoa 2. It's something to do if you're bored, but not exactly anything substantial. The Wii version also adds a movie viewer, which was great for helping me record Phantom Island versions of cutscenes. Finally, you get a character viewer, which lets you look at all of the character models in the game. That's kind of neat, but not exactly earth-shattering. I appreciate the efforts made to add new things to the original Door to Phantomile, but they all range from somewhat neat to annoying to simply unimpressive. So, remake or rebreak. How does Klonoa Door to Phantomile for the Wii compare to the PlayStation original? Overall, I'd give this game a remake score. It's a faithful re-release that improves on the original experience and makes a good faith effort to add new content. The controls are also slightly better thanks to the improved range of the wind bullet, the graphics have been remade from scratch and look amazing, and the story presentation has been refined in some ways. The The remake also gives you the option to play the game with English voice acting, which is actually pretty good beyond casting Eric Stitt as Klonoa. And if you really hate the English voice acting that much, just play the game in Phantomile for Pete's sake. Where the remake falls flat is in its attempts to add new content. The costumes, time attack, movie viewer, and character viewer are all okay, but they're really nothing special either. Then there's the reverse mode, which doesn't really do anything new with the levels, while the added challenge rooms are just frustrating. The fact that the remake actually makes the game even easier without adding any higher difficulties is another shortcoming. The greatest disappointment for me, however, is the lack of any new levels. The original game was only 14 levels long. There is absolutely no good reason why there couldn't have been another Extravision or something. If the remake had included these things, I wouldn't hesitate to bump it up to a replay score. Regardless, Klonoa for the Wii is an excellent remake and one that I would highly recommend to newcomers and fans of the series alike. Something that kind of surprised me is that there's a decent number of people out there who really don't care for this remake. And while it certainly could have been better than it is, I think many people exaggerate the quality difference between the Wii version and the original. I get the impression that some Klonoa fans have a very close relationship with the PlayStation door to Phantomile, and that years of playing it have given them a very specific, subjective idea about what door to Phantomile is and what it ought to be, and the changes to the remake depart from that very specific subjective image. I am not saying that it's wrong for people to prefer the original, and for the record, I played that version years before I even touched the remake. But you've got to give credit to the remake where credit is due, and recognize that not everybody has that same specific subjective impression of what this game ought to be. I can't in good faith call Klonoa for the Wii a bad remake, it just does too many things right. But what about Klonoa Door to Phantomile in general? Overall, it's an excellent gem for the PlayStation and Wii libraries, and one that I would highly recommend to fans of the puzzle and platforming genres. The story is great and surprisingly substantial, featuring a cast of likable characters, a number of twists and turns, and a handful of darker, sadder moments that adults will appreciate. The graphics are still appealing today, with the Wii version standing out as one of the best looking games on the system. The soundtrack is phenomenal, with a wide assortment of varied and memorable tracks. The gameplay puts a welcome puzzle spin on the familiar side-scrolling formula, making use of simple but surprisingly deep mechanics to craft a unique platforming experience that I really don't think you can get anywhere else. Sure, the game's fairly easy and the early bosses are pushovers, but I enjoyed the overall experience too much to really care about those things. If what you've seen in the footage interests you, I'd suggest checking the game out for yourself. Which version would I recommend? It's tough to decide. On one hand, the original is an impressive, unique experience for the PlayStation, and one that fans of the system should definitely check out. On the other hand, the Wii remake is demonstrably superior to the original in several aspects, despite a handful of shortcomings. I'd say that if you were to get only one version of Klonoa Door to Phantomile, get the remake. At the same time, I can honestly recommend both versions to anyone with the cash to spare. If you're gonna get the PS1 version, I'd recommend getting it off PSN for your PSP, Vita, and PS3. If you try to buy an original disc copy, it's gonna cost you a pretty penny, and it's really not worth it for a game you can beat in 3.5 hours.
And that pretty much covers Klonoa Door to Phantomile. Join me next time for the second game in the series, Klonoa Moonlight Museum for the Bandai WonderSwan. Until next time, I am ExoParadigmGamer, and I hope you all enjoyed the review.
I haven't been this hairy since the last time I vaped. Alright, listen. You don't get high when you vape, Michael. Fucking take that, Eric shit.